All right. I'm Murad Bhaidani with Ruckus. And one of my colleagues presented part one of separating the bark from the bite at Prague. And so this is sort of a continuation to it. But as I sat through the first day of presentation, and again this morning, I realized first we had Wes talking about 6 gigahertz, then we had Daryl talk about AFC, then we had Jatin talk about Wi-Fi 7, and this morning we had David talk about Wi-Fi 7 as well. So as I was sort of tweaking my slides, it reminded me of I'm a tea sommelier as a hobbyist. And then so it reminded me that, you know, whether you drink green tea, white tea, black tea, or pu'er, which is fermented for 15 years, it comes from exactly the same leaf. And then so we all get a chance to perfect and provide some sort of a perspective to it. So I'm going to skip through some of the earlier slides just as a refresher from the piece that we did in Prague. I'll cover some of those pieces right there. But I left this there because it said that once you say something or you put something out there, you lose control over what meaning people derive from it. And so I'll let you derive whatever meaning you want to, given that the company is Ruckus that I'm representing here. Yeah? So we talked a little bit about all of these, so I'm not going to go over any of those slides. But I do want to provide an update that probably August is the time one of the last Plug Fest will take place. Again, there is contingency if there is some slippage for it to go beyond for some additional Plug Fest. But we'll probably hear something more from WBA later on today. But in addition to that, we are also mindful that typically the WFA program that takes place, it usually takes around 4 to 5 months post the final Plug Fest. And then so we need to be mindful of that. And even though I have R2 on there, there is no agreement yet on R2. Yeah? So these were some of the candidates that we talked about in Prague, and you heard a lot from everybody else, whether it was on the extreme high throughput on the PHY side, whether it was on enhanced distributed EDCA channel access. And so in addition to that, we heard a lot about MLO. I was going to first talk a little bit more about MLO, but I'm going to skip that piece as well and come down to something that we haven't heard much about today. And that is, or yesterday, to look at 6 gigahertz spectrum. When we actually look at 6 gigahertz, the very first thing that we think about, wow, we got 1,200 megahertz available to us, right? And then you start peeling the onion. And then you start seeing, basically, where do we have this available? So I have a chart here that you are seeing, which goes over basically where we are, which countries have adopted it, and which countries are considering it. So there are two basically categories. The first one is lower 6 gigahertz, which is basically 500 megahertz that you get. And that's something that you'll see with the maroon, sort of reddish colored. And then you have the green, which basically is the entire 1,200 megahertz available, both lower 6 gigahertz as well as upper 6 gigahertz, right? And so the dark green are those that have already adopted it. The light green are those that are considering it. And the same thing goes for the darker maroon color, which is those who have adopted the 500 megahertz in the lower 6 gigahertz spectrum. And then you have the lighter sort of reddish maroon color, those who are considering. As you can see, a big chunk of the world is still non-colored. Yeah? And so one other thing that I want you to focus on is on the right-hand side, you'll notice AFC, right? So you have countries like Australia, you have Canada, you have Mexico, you have Saudi Arabia, you have, of course, the United States, that you'll see that are adopting the AFC format for basically automated frequency. And so I wanted to go down a little bit more into it because we haven't heard much on this and sort of add on to what Daryl had shared yesterday when we first saw the waterfall that he had shared. I love the graphics that he typically uses. So here are all of the incumbents. Yeah? So you'll see fixed satellite service, you'll see fixed microwave, which is what we'll talk a little bit more about. You'll see fixed mobile and radio astronomy. And so there is something that I also wanted to add, because I don't have it on the slide, that radio astronomy actually has certain frequencies that are basically in certain parts of the US won't be available to us. But this is where we stand in terms of microwave links today in the lower 6 gigahertz spectrum. There are 26,000 microwave links utilizing 71,000 number of frequencies. Yeah? And so you can see that there are a lot of incumbents in this area. And of course, a lot of temp licenses have been provided in the very recent years to some of the vendors who may be here as well. And so when you look at this, you start thinking, all right, so we had 12 megahertz, so now where do we go from here? These are some of the incumbents that I thought would be interesting to list as to who uses the most out of these links. And so this is in the lower 6 gigahertz on the left-hand side and the upper 6 gigahertz on the right-hand side. Something that I want to spend a little bit of time on as a result of the incumbents, there are certain rules that have been adopted. So the first thing that we need to be mindful of is there is low power indoors. 4 things to consider. It has to be indoors. It has to have integrated antennas, not weatherproofed, and no batteries. Yeah? And so that's up to 30 dB of EIRP. And in that same sense, standard power, which would be nothing that other than what we talked about from indoor AP standpoint. And in this particular case, you get an additional 6 dB. Yeah? So it goes up to 36 dBm is the max EIRP for that. And then there is something that no rule has been made by the commission yet, but there is something called very low power, which basically is 14 dBm EIRP. In this case, you would not have to go to AFC. And then so having laid down that piece, standard power is only available in lower 6 gigahertz and then in Uni 7. So that together gives you around 850 megahertz altogether. Yeah? And so low power is available all across the 1200. So let's talk a little bit about some additional caveats. So the first thing is it's prohibited on oil platforms, cars, trains, boats, and aircrafts other than those large aircrafts flying 10,000 feet or higher. Yeah? And then one other piece that I want to add is that because of satellite communication, if I'm going to have an elevation of 30 degrees above the horizon, then my max EIRP cannot be more than 21 dBm. Yeah? So let's talk briefly about AFC operation. So the first thing is, AFC, how many of you are CPI for CBRS, Certified Public Installers or Professional Installers? So this is a lot easier. There are no certifications per se. But unlike CBRS, you also don't have SAS or AFCs talking to each other, right? Everything is based on the ULS database that's available with FCC. And so every single AP, every single device has to register on a daily basis or call in on a daily basis. And then there's a grace period up to 11:59 p.m. the following day, after which it has to shut down if it has not called back. Yeah? And so there is a requirement, just like you had on CBRS for geolocation. And so in this particular case, you could have GPS built in or geolocation capabilities built in. It's expected to provide X and Y, which is basically latitude and longitude coordinates, and the installer is supposed to provide the height or the altitude as part of that submission. You could also have a common device, basically what it's called. You could have a GPS device that could apply to other devices as well. And so then you have an area of uncertainty that you also provide to FCC. This was what was in SAS. Quite complicated in terms of the communication that takes place. And I know I have 15 seconds left. I'll just take another 30 seconds if it's okay. This is much simpler. It's basically you go back to the AFC, get the recommendations, and you apply it. There's nothing else that's happening as compared to how the SAS operated. When is it expected? Summer of this year. And so I've left particularly vague as compared to providing specific timeline. These are the 13 conditionally approved AFC systems. And then with that, here's a QR code for one of my colleagues at ComSearch who has some amazing details around AFC that you may be able to access. Thank you.